Dear audience, I'm happy that I can present here on the Day of Archaeology in a very special form. And this is not the first time that this unique case from prehistoric archaeology of Hungary is presented. How in Budapest, this finding was presented in like in a theater for the audience, with the title "The Anatomy of Transcendence," and it was chosen because this case basically is a burial of people from late Copper Age site, and usually in prehistoric, when we want to interpret such findings, we sometimes need to think like the people in this time to understand such special cases of burials. Because we usually find cemeteries with single graves in different positions of bodies, but sometimes we meet with very chaotic forms of burials of people in multiple burials or mass graves, and these people are usually buried in a very unusual position, and this is always the very unique cases of funerary customs in historical times, which sometimes very hard to interpret. Now we are in Hungary at Balaton-Szentgyörgy on a site which was excavated in 2017 and between 18. Just as I said, we found not a normative burial as for us in modern times, but a very unusual pit with skeletons, and pit was dated to the late Copper Age, which is basically the time of Ötzi the Iceman, who was found in the mountains mummified, which made him famous. At the same time, just before the Bronze Age, in the Carpathian Basin in the Copper Age, we also having a very rich life here. And this settlement, what we found, is dated to this period. Usually in Copper Age we find such burials like you can see here. So people in this time buried in a fetal position, usually with many accessories, vessel depositions, or their tools, what they used or had during their lifetime. So these are usually very rich burials, but single burials. So what made this case so special? Why these people were buried in this pit together against what we usually see in this time? This led us to just what we see today in the very popular crime scene series like Dr. Bones do. So to a very special method, but usually is applied in forensic anthropology or archaeology. So not only the bones are described and analyzed, but also the environment where it was found is very detailed. How we study them, and we try to put up these little mosaics together to find answers for such deviancy. So we are at Balaton. We are just standing at the edge of this pit where these skeletons were found, and fortunately I could join to the excavation at the very early stage, and I could make by my own the documentation, like photo documenting, photo recording, drawing, and the descriptions of the burial and the excavation itself, which helped me a lot when I went back to the laboratory with the bones and analyzed them. the lab work usually starts with recording of age and sex of the skeletons, and in this case in the pit it made really complicated that most of the skeletons were incomplete and showed disturbing basically skulls and the skeletal elements had to be paired in the lab work based on the age and sex data, and also using the phenomena of the certain traits of bones. Basically, I paired the skeletal elements together to build up individual skeletons. So basically, we cannot tell exactly how many people were buried in this pit, just estimated, and it seems that near 30 people were in this pit, and equally infants and adults. And it was very interesting that mainly youngs were in this pit. The other way to look at such burials is how we have to look at how it looks like, because they can be show what was the cause of forming them. And there are certain types of mass graves, and there are not only mass graves but multiple burials, but I will tell what is the difference between them later on. So talking about mass graves, when people are buried together in certain form, can happen if there is a big epidemic in a certain community, like was during the plague in the medieval Europe, and we find many examples now for that from London, Paris, and usually these cemeteries contains equal distribution of age and sex, so all the there is no difference between the different members of the community, all of them affected equally during these epidemics, and usually they are buried in line, in a row, very close together. However, it is very hard to tell what kind of disease or bacteria cause the death of these people. It's usually not, it cannot be read out from the bones, just if we do microbial analysis of bone samples, and we can detect the DNA of bacteria in the bones, like plague, and the reason of that is that certain the disease is the activity of bacteria which causes inflammation in the body, and eventually on the skeletal tissue has to last for enough time to form these bony lesions as well. So in case of plague, when the death happened only after 2 or 3 days, the bone was not affected as much like other tissues, so we don't see any changes on the bone. However, if the disease lasted for weeks or even months, we can see bone depositions on the long bones or anywhere in the skeleton, or if it was a lung infection, we can see bony depositions on the ribs, or if the meninges were affected, we can see the signs of that in the skull as well. However, epidemics can lead to such burial forms, but diseases which produce very frightening symptoms can also cause deviant behavior in a community, as we saw, for instance, on certain medieval sites. And however, they were very far away from each other. These cases were linked by this meninges inflammation, meningitis, In these pits were mainly children, and in one case even a dog was buried with them, which is a symbol of very bad things in medieval times. So if we think over what symptoms this disease can cause, like in the behavior of the patient who can speak randomly certain things, be high fever. So this could be very frightening for a medieval people, and maybe this caused that these individuals were buried far away from the settlement or even the cemetery of their community. So this was a medieval example, but this can happen in prehistoric times as well. The other reason we find mass burials is the interpersonal conflicts of historical times, like battles. What we know from Hungary only from Mohács. This site was recovered and reburied later, but now it's again under investigation. What we see in this case is that people are in the pit, usually very tightened to each other and thrown in, and then mainly young males are found in these sites. However, in prehistoric, we find pits for probably the signs of such events, and in these pits not only males but females, children are also found. And how can we even though connect to these interpersonal conflicts? It's in these cases we can find traumatic injuries like fractures of the skull or other bones, which happened at the time of death or before death, healed ones, or cut marks at the time of death, or even fragments of weapon can be found in such bones. So these are the signs of conflict events. However, I have to tell that in prehistoric we don't expect big battles, mass burials, but rather these are the signs of conflicts between communities. It can also happen that on the buried bones we find certain disturbations which are due to animal scavenging, like tooth marks and certain parts of the skeletons. It's known from the Tatar invasion or the Roman time in Hungary, when also attacks of communities happened, and the burying happened very much later than the attack itself, and the bodies were disturbed by the surrounding animals. So we can see such marks, and we have to look at it if we find them. The third reason that a community can form such burial can be due to ritual activity, but we have to be very cautious with that because we cannot really tell if those people were buried because of a ritual activity or a reason which made the community to perform such ritual, like disasters, catastrophes, or events in their life. But in certain times it can be suspected that some kind of activity are related to these events, to these burials, and these are like animal depositions in these pits, and it's very interesting that not every kind of animal, so it's very important to look at what kind of animal we see, and it also looks like that certain parts of these animals are put in these pits. And also we have to see vessel depositions in these pits to to look at these features as a sign of ritual activity. So these signs has to be repeated to establish this theory. Actually, in these kind of vessels, probably they put also some kind of fluids or foods which are related to this ritual. Even in one site from Balatonasad, it's a contemporary site, there was a pit with human bodies where they found a mask fragment, so it's a very obvious sign of kind of unusual activity of the burial. To interpret this site, this pit, we couldn't really go further with the bone analysis. So first we looked at other sites from this period to help explain why we see what we see on this site. We chose two very important sites. One was from Balatonasad, what I mentioned before, and the other was Abony, which is a very important site. Both of them actually are very complicated, both archaeologically and anthropologically. They are very much showing these ritual activities in their features, and Abony is very important because it's the first case of leprosy in the world, the earliest case, and probably this disease is related to the death of these people found in these massive burials. Also, these sites contained more signs of unusual features, like not only human body depositions, but animal body depositions. And interestingly, at Abony, in the graves where humans were found in such a way, mainly goats, sheep's bones were found, and dogs. So at our site, when we looked at these bones, we couldn't find any traumas or disease which could help us to explain why these people were buried in the same pit. So we had to use other methods of anthropology, which helps us to reconstruct how these bodies were deposited in a certain feature, and these can be read out from the position of the bones, basically how the body was decomposed can be reconstructed from the bones position what we found, and that's why it was very important to record it in a detailed way. Basically, we look at the gestures of the bodies, and it was very interesting that only one skeleton was almost complete, the most upper one. Probably this individual was the last one which was put in this pit. And however, the skull was missing, but the whole postcranial skeleton was presented, and we could see it in a half-sitting position. And what was very interesting that some bones were very far, some elements were very far from each other, like we see in the case of the tibia and the femur. So basically the knee joint, when it was decomposed, the bones could move very much during this process. And it was also very important data that the skulls under the skeleton were empty, so they were not filled with the soil around them. And this can happen if somebody is not buried, or somebody was put in a coffin, which avoided the body from the surrounding soil. And basically, during the decomposition process, the body can move a lot, and therefore the bones as well. But if it would feel straight after putting it in a grave, this cannot happen because the soil not allow it. So it means that this pit probably was not closed and filled filled when the body was put in this pit straight, and it was true for the previous bodies as well, and that's why we see this disturbed form, because probably this pit was used not just one time but multiple times, and that's why it's not a mass burial, what I talked, but a multiple burial. So in a certain period this pit was reused again and again to put bodies in, and the previous bodies probably was disturbed by this activity, and also the decomposing process caused this disturbed form, so the bones were moving a lot during the decomposing process. After we joined the two types of data, one was the excavation data, which was recorded on the site, and the other was the osteological data recorded in the lab work, the age and sex. And this led us also to find information about the structure of the pit, what can we see in the different layers, and we can also study certain positions of bones, and we could find two legs of two individuals in mirrorly in this pit in a crouched position, and after pairing the certain skeletal elements, mainly in the case of this individual, the upper elements and the lower elements could be paired in the laboratory analysis. And after looking at the drawing and the photo recording, I could also see that these two body parts basically could not be recognized on during the excavation, because the lower element of the body went due to the gravity much lower than the upper body elements lifted in a lower position toward the center of the pit due to gravity, and the legs, the lower elements, were in an upper position, stayed in an upper position. So basically, we used a kind of photo recording called photogrammetry, which helps us to build up a 3D image of the pit, and this basically could help us to connect these two elements. And it also gave information about the original position of this individual, that it was thrown in the pit and the upper body was facing down, while the legs and the lower body was facing toward the edge of the pit. So it was a very twisted position. It doesn't show any sign of intentional positioning. And after we go lower in this pit, we look at the age distribution. It told that the children remains, the ratio of children remains are more if we go in the pit. So it means when they open this pit, the first individuals probably were children who were put here. And we just arrived to the very important part of the pit, in the bottom. And this was the only layer, basically, which showed us some kind of ritual activity. But both what I mentioned, the vessel depositions, and also a young young pig was also found here at the bottom. So basically these two signs of ritual activity was found in this pit as well, just in the other two sides. In Abony, these vessels are very important in these sites, in these cases, as it's shown in Abony. Even a fetus was found in one, so probably the containing, what they contained, it must be very important to study later on. What was also interesting, but not was very helpful during the anthropological analysis, it was a kind of calcified deposition of soil on the bones, which made hard to study them, but at the same way it was very unusual for me, and I wanted to know if I see on normal burials from the site as well, or it's just only found in this pit. And well, this theory seemed to be true, that only this pit, only the bones in this pit show this calcified soil deposition on the bones. However, there was one skeleton also from this side, which had this deposition on the bones, and later on it turned out that it's also not a proper burial but a pit, and it was a child also in an unusual position, in a thrown-in position in this pit, and even this soil deposition conservated the bones, the bones together, and so a fish remain was under the child's foot, which could remain because of this calcification, cementation of the soil. Well, after seeing that, I looked at again what we can see on the potteries, the ceramics in our pit, and I also found this soil deposition on the potteries. However, there was one which only showed the half of it, this deposition. And after talking with geologists in the lab, they told me that this kind of this kind of soil deposition can form if there was a change in ground level in the pit or in the feature, especially if they think that it was open, it could happen. And this deposition contained organic materials, so it looked like mud basically. And in the case of this pot, we could see that one side probably was affected by this deposition. The other side was in a protected center of this mass of the pit, and that's why we don't see this deposition on the pottery. So basically, we are very close to the Balaton, especially in the Cooperage. This area was flooded many times, and it's probably, if the pit was open, could happen that it was flooded sometime, and that's why it was not a human infilling but a natural infilling of the pit, what eventually closed these graves. Mad ID because even in the surrounding area we find wells, not only from this period but later on. Our excavation was sometimes disturbed by big floods on the site. In this other pit I mentioned, we found very few bones of another child. It gave another information because on these bones we found tooth marks of animals. So basically this child was not buried straight after its death, or the pit was open, maybe was disturbed by surrounding animals. So it is a very interesting phenomenon. On this site, we found the unusual position of bodies in a pit, and we found incomplete skeletons, which probably due to the reusage of this pit, which disturbed previous bodies, previous skeletons putting here. And we found, just as in other prehistoric sites, a high number of infants. However, we don't know answer why this phenomena appears in the prehistoric. What we don't find, didn't find traumas which could explain the cause of death of these individuals, or pathologies which also can help to explain this burial form, not like in Abony, the leprosy was. And we didn't find a cemetery yet, which can be related to this settlement, so we don't know the normal burial forms, the ritual, the general ritual, what we could compare to this pit, or we could compare the individuals from normal burials to these ones buried here in this pit. But we found animal and vessel depositions, which are the signs of ritual activity. And however, compared to other sites, in Balaton Sendjör, this was in a simple or in a not a very complex way presented, but it was here. And basically, this led back to what I found in the beginning of this presentation, that we have to think a little bit in a way as a people thought in this period. So basically, with Eliada's words, ritual is a very important in this time, and while for modern consciousness, for modern people, our everyday life activities are very are part of our life, and but in old times, especially in prehistoric times, every kind of activity could be a chance to connect to the transcendence, maybe even in a mechanic way, but it was always important to show for this relationship of the community to the transcendent or the nature. And this can be seen on this site as well. However, for modern people, we are in another dimension now, namely in the virtual space. I hope this presentation was also enjoyable, even though, and I really thank you for your kind attention.